Tesla shares are near a record as the company confirming robotaxi tests without a driver are underway in Austin. Tech analyst Dan Ives saying Tesla's ambitions in the autonomous business could drive it to a $3 trillion valuation by the end of 2026. When we talked to Garrett Nelson, CFRA research analyst, he's not quite as confident.
Looking at consensus numbers for 26 and 27, we think they're too high still, and we haven't seen the worst of the drop-off in their EV sales. In a couple weeks, when they report fourth quarter sales, we will see that fourth quarter being the first full quarter in which the U.S. market was not subsidized in terms of any sort of EV tax credit.
Dan Ives, Wedbush Managing Director of Global Head of Technology Research, is joining me now in the studio. Dan, I know what you're going to say. He's too focused on the spreadsheets. He's too focused on the car business. I know what you're going to say by now. But this is how the company makes most of its money right now. So, yes, I understand the AI future, but what about the car present for Tesla?
I mean, look, if you're owning it for numbers and for the car business, I mean, I think that's the wrong reason. I mean, in my
but it has to fund the other stuff, right? And it's funding it in part through selling cars. So it has to sell enough cars in order to not just make a profit, but also to fund some of these ambitions, right?
I look at it almost like a bracket, like in other words, like a worst case, base case, best case. As long as it's sort of above a worst case, and I think now it is in terms of deliveries, then the business model continues to play out, and that ultimately does fund what I really view as the key piece, right, which is autonomous and robotics future. Look, in terms of, if you started this year, and I told you where numbers was going to be at the end of the year, you're like, where's the stock going to be based on those numbers? You'd be like, it's $200, $250.
Right.
But it speaks to my view, I mean, you've talked about it a lot, is that when you look at physical AI plays, there's NVIDIA and Tesla's, I think the two best out there. And now it's about proving it out. But that, as an investor right now, if you're bullish on Tesla, you're not focused on consensus 26.
Of course.
But to your point, I do think deliveries has stabilized. I think China's actually shown growth. And you look at the last few quarters, like it's actually better than expected.
I'm curious, because you said you have worst case, base case, best case. What's your worst case scenario for Tesla?
Well, I think worst case, if you go back like 6 months ago, I mean, we were
that felt like worst case, yeah.
It felt like worst case because also given deliveries, given a lot of the brand issues, given what you saw in Europe, and obviously, tax credits coming off in terms of the U.S. So we were trending toward a worst case. And look, it spoke to my view where Musk needed to be a wartime CEO focused on this core Tesla chapter, which I view as probably the most important chapter ever for Tesla and for Musk. So I think you now are seeing a different Elon. You're seeing a different company. And look, Julie, I think we sit here a year from now, the stock's at 650, 700, or it's lower than here. In other words, like this is a very
like a make or break year.
I'd call it a make or break year, and I think it's going to be make relative to autonomous 30 cities, showing the volume production, not just delaying it. I think that's why it's such an important year.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple of the goals there. Like, give me the top 3 things that it needs to do this year to push it higher rather than going lower.
Well, one, I mean, you need to be in 30 cities. I mean, when you look at Austin and now what we're seeing in California and some other cities, you need to be in 30 cities by summer.
With the robotaxis.
With robotaxi. So that's one. 2, no safety driver. Now you're starting to see that now in Austin. We saw it firsthand. You need to see the geofence area expand to a point where I believe it gets significantly more than where Waymo is, right? Relative to even having a huge head start. And I think the third is volume production. In other words, like you actually need to show volume production of cyber cabs coming out of Gigafactory in Austin. Look, I think those are the 3 that are extremely important to show. Okay, is the whole story going to take hold this year? No. But it shows that like those are huge building blocks to what I view as kind of the future of Tesla.
And it's interesting that you say that because like Musk has always been good at vision and big pronouncements, but what you're talking about is execution. And there his record has been less even or at least less consistent on time, right? He's had a lot of delays in the past. So you're confident, though, that you think he can hit those goals?
Look, it's just like SpaceX. I mean, you're trying to solve the most complex AI, I'd say like some of the biggest problems out there. When you do get to full autonomous, you're dealing with lives, you can't just be 99%. I mean, so you're talking about the margin of error you almost can't even, look at in a spreadsheet. So this is something where it's so important that they do this from a safety perspective and continue to stretch it out step by step. But look, I mean, I think autonomous alone is worth $1 trillion. And I think when you look at robotic, you look at Optimus, you look at this all playing out, that's how I get to, in a bull case, a $3 trillion valuation, at the end of 26.
Okay, I'm curious about something. I know that they've put Grok in some of the Teslas, right, which is the XAI LLM. Have you been in one of them that has Grok? Like, how do you even, do you talk to it while you're driving? What do you do with it?
Yeah, it's interacting with it, and I think that's something.
You just like need somebody to chat with? You chat with your Grok in the car? What do you do with it?
But to some extent, it speaks to like that's going to expand, because the whole view is that this is all part of the Musk ecosystem. I mean, Tesla is going to own, I think, a decent sized piece of XAI. You look at SpaceX that's going to go public next year, and I think it's possible Tesla will also have ownership, or at least a piece of SpaceX. And then you look at Grok and you look at everything that's happening here. I mean, I think eventually what this is all going to, there's going to be some holding structure that you're probably as a public entity in terms of Tesla, XAI, whatever they own of SpaceX and some other things. But look, I think this is sort of the vision for Elon. He recognizes in this arms race with Altman, with Jensen, with Nadella, with what we see Palantir and everything else, this is the time. This is not a time to watch from the sideline.
Yeah. Okay. I was just talking to Mohammed about how he uses. Thank you. How he uses these large language models. Which ones are you? I'm curious. Are you a ChatGPT guy? Are you a Grok guy? And how are you using it?
ChatGPT, also Gemini. Use a little Grok and Perplexity. So I use it for different things. I think each has its strength. Now, look, I use it every day in terms of like organization, content. It's one where like solving different problems, like my travel. I mean, so depending on different ways, like I use them, but it's something where this is just the beginning, because you think about like autonomous, like most consumers, the models are just the beginning. It's going to be like robotics. It's going to be, when you look at autonomous, it's going to be what ultimately will be like an Apple having a true AI store in terms of apps. And I think that's where everything's heading. This is just a year 3 of an 8 to 10 year build out.
I know that Brian Sozzi, I don't know if you know, OpenAI is Yahoo Finance Company of the Year. And he was zeroing in on the idea that OpenAI might come out with a phone at some point. Do you think that's a competitor for the iPhone, or do you think no?
I wouldn't say necessarily competitive to the iPhone, just like when we've seen other companies try to, go after that. But it does speak to what Sal's talking about as OpenAI, like they're planting flags everywhere. Because what they're essentially doing is like, look, they're building the stack. I mean, you could say it's a combo Amazon, Apple, Google all combined in terms of what they're doing. Look, some have criticized in terms of that, and I think you've seen names like Oracle, obviously, that's been overhang on it. But I just continue to view, like, you're building out a new economy. Like, you're talking about trillions being spent. And for the first time in 30 years, the US is ahead of China when it comes to tech. And that's very important relative to where OpenAI stands and relative to, I think, the US ecosystem in terms of big tech.
There's another stock I want to ask you about, and that is CoreWeave, which, as you know, has sold off pretty sharply. Maybe the company didn't sort of message very well about some delays at one of its data centers in terms of construction, or one of the data centers it's leasing, not that it owns. Are you worried about that name, in terms of execution risk, in terms of debt, in terms of the business model?
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, because I look at CoreWeave, Nebius is another one in terms of some of the neo clouds. Look, my view is like, you're going to see things quarter to quarter move out. You're going to see some blemishes in this really fourth industrial revolution. But I don't view it as sort of these panic moments, everyone heads for the elevator, yelling fire in a crowded theater. I mean, I do think this is one where it's going to be hyper-focused, but the onus is on them to execute, communicate it. Because right now, like, look, investors are so sensitive naturally, right, in terms of, like, is this a bubble? Again, like I've told you, I think it's 10:30 p.m. in that AI part that goes to 4 a.m. But these are the responsibilities on the companies to communicate.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. Like, I understand the thesis on the whole AI space, But if there are ones that are maybe a little bit higher risk in terms of messaging and execution, why not avoid that one? Why just not buy the other ones that don't necessarily have that risk?
No, and like in our ETF, like we have the 30 AI win. I mean, CoreWeave's one of them. But the point is, like, you can just like bet on one company. I think you do have to, like, whether it's Godfather of AI, Jensen, NVIDIA, whether it's AMD, whether it's Micron, on the software on the hyperscaler side, bet on your Palantirs, the MongoDBs, the energy companies, the GE Vernovas, and others. So I do think, like, to that point,
You disperse it.
because you have to think about like a barbell approach. If you just bet on one, there's risk, right? In terms of like what could happen with that company. I mean, Oracle being a perfect example. I think when it comes to the best way to play AI revolution, you have to own some chip names, software.
But I guess I'm asking, why not avoid, say, a CoreWeave and an Oracle? Why not just leave them out?
Yeah, look, but to that point is investors be like, oh, you don't touch them, they're toxic. But then let's say 6-9 months from now, you're like, okay, how come I didn't buy Oracle 180 when now it's 240? So my view is like, if there was structural issues, if I didn't believe in the thesis, if there was something that felt like it was a business model change, then you avoid them. But I don't believe that is, but it speaks to like, look, you need like, you know, strong hands and sort of a strong stomach to battle through some of these sort of like waves that we're going to see, the DeepSeek moments, Liberation Day. I mean, we'll have more in 26, right? But it speaks to my view. Like, you'll be wearing a S&P 7,000 hat, an 8,000 hat in New York Stock. Like, that's my view. Where we're 2 more years left in the tech bull market. And again, the bears in hibernation mode. They can't see in their spreadsheets. They missed every transformational tech stock the last 20 years. Focus on what could happen.
Okay. We'll talk again, Dan. Thank you so much for coming in. Appreciate it.